He didn't lie to you, not with words. He didn't need to. The language he spoke was ancient, older than memory, deeper than logic. And you heard it not with your ears, but with the parts of your soul that had long been silent. He told you he saw into you, that he had touched the dark, mythic places you never dared to enter alone. And when he left, it wasn't with cruelty, but with the quiet detachment of someone who had already written your story before you knew it began. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." What if he knew that? What if he used that? What if the one who awakened your soul never planned to stay? He came to you not as a man, but as a myth. That's how it begins. You didn't fall for him. You fell for the idea of him, shaped not just by his presence, but by something far more insidious. Your own longing, mirrored back at you. In Jungian terms, this was the anima projection. Your psyche casting the feminine soul image onto him, demanding recognition, craving unity. But what you didn't realize is that he was doing the exact same thing. You were never lovers. You were each other's unfinished dreams, rehearsing old wounds in new language. He spoke to you about depth. He talked of synchronicity, of how chance encounters are never chance, of how something bigger was moving through your connection. And you believed him. Of course you did. The words weren't lies, they were truths in disguise. But here's the first sign. He only showed up when you were open, when you were vulnerable. Not because he wanted to protect that openness, but because he needed it to reflect his own significance back at him. You became the screen onto which he could project his heroic journey. You weren't his partner. You were his mirror. He listened so carefully, didn't he? Like he was drinking in your soul with a kind of reverence. But as time passed, you noticed the pattern. He listened when your pain was fresh, when you were raw. But when you gained clarity, strength, boundaries, he withdrew. Not cruelly, just less available, less urgent. He didn't want you healed. He wanted you open, because your healing meant the game would end. And for someone who needed to feel like the wounded healer, you recovering was not part of the story he was writing for himself. This isn't about villainy. Jung taught us that the human psyche is rarely that simple. People don't use others out of malice. They use others out of blindness, to their own shadows, to their unlived lives, to the parts of themselves they refuse to face. And so they seek out those who carry the very fire they are too afraid to hold. You had fire, and he wanted warmth, but not the responsibility of tending the flame. That's the second sign. He spiritualized your pain, but never stayed to help you through it. You thought you had found someone who understood, but what he gave you was interpretation, not intimacy. A kind of intellectual transcendence that left you more alone than before. He offered symbolic language instead of concrete presence. You told him about your childhood, your fears, your dreams, and he nodded. Even quoted Jung, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." You were stunned. You felt seen. But then, he vanished for a week. You mistook that disappearance for processing. You thought he needed space to integrate the depth of what you had shared. But no, he wasn't integrating. He was done. That story served its purpose. It made him feel like the wise man, the soul companion, the interpreter of hidden truths. But you weren't a person to him anymore. You were a vessel for his self-image. You were the patient. He was the analyst. The dance was never equal. Sign 3. He gave you language for your wounds, but not safety, not consistency. There's a kind of seduction in being understood, especially by someone fluent in psychological myth. When he said your dream of drowning meant the unconscious was calling you deeper, your skin buzzed. You believed him because it made the pain meaningful. And for a while, meaning is enough, until it isn't. Because the human heart doesn't need analysis. It needs holding. Jung said that people don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. What he forgot to add is this: no one should do that alone. And you were alone, weren't you? emotionally, spiritually, psychically alone. Even in his arms, if you ever made it that far. Even when he looked at you with that gaze that said, "I see you." Because what he saw wasn't you. It was a reflection of his own hunger. A hunger to be needed, admired, worshipped. He was not using you for your body. He was using you for your depth. And this is perhaps the most invisible form of exploitation, because it flatters the ego, disguises itself as awakening, and leaves no visible scars. Only a strange sense of being emptied out, slowly, silently, until all you can do is ask, was any of it real? And that's the fourth sign. You started to feel like a metaphor in your own life. He talked to you in symbols. You became the alchemical vessel, the sacred feminine, the muse. Beautiful poetic names, but never just you, the real you. The one who wanted Sunday mornings and small joys and someone who actually called when they said they would. But he wasn't interested in the real you. He was interested in the myth, because he wasn't writing your story. He was writing his own. And you were a subplot, essential for a chapter, disposable when the arc was complete. He told you this was soul work. But real soul work doesn't leave you hollow. There are two more signs, but they don't show up in conversations. They show up in absence, in the places where he promised to be, and wasn't. Sometimes the soul chooses pain, not because it enjoys suffering, but because it recognizes its own shape in the burn. In the beginning, it felt like medicine. He walked into your life carrying words like sacred relics, alchemy, shadow, individuation. You weren't used to being spoken to like that. Most people talked at you. He spoke through you. And for a while, you confused that with love. That's the fifth sign. You mistook spiritual resonance for emotional commitment. He told you that he too had suffered. He opened the gates to his inner world just enough for you to glimpse the tragic theater behind his eyes. There was a boy inside him, he said, lost in the vastness of the collective unconscious. You were the one who found him there, he claimed. You were the one who made him feel real again. What he didn't say, what he perhaps didn't know, was that you had become his therapist, his spiritual midwife. You were not equals. You were the container. He transposed all his unhealed patterns onto you. The good ones, the broken ones, and you received them, thinking this was intimacy. But that's not intimacy. That's transference. Jung knew this all too well. His early work with female patients was marred by this very phenomenon, the romantic entanglement between healer and seeker. The boundary lines blur, and when one person is doing all the holding, all the absorbing, they begin to lose themselves in the other's storm. You thought his transparency was a bridge, but it was a confessional, a release valve. You bore the weight, and he walked away lighter. He would vanish for days, no explanation, no warning. And when he returned, it was with soft apologies wrapped in poetry. He'd say he was doing deep work, that he had to retreat inward. You respected that. You believed in inner journeys, and so you forgave him, again and again. But this is the sixth sign. He used absence as control, not loudly, not with threat, but with subtle, devastating precision. He knew you would wait. He knew you wanted to wait, because somewhere along the line, he had convinced you that waiting was part of the spiritual path. That detachment was a test of devotion. That if you truly trusted the process, you wouldn't need reassurance. You wouldn't need consistency. But that's not transcendence. That's neglect, dressed in silk robes. You weren't asking for worship. You were asking for presence. For a text that said, "I'm still here." For the gentleness of someone who knew that your nervous system, your heart, your inner child needed more than dreams. They needed ground. But he didn't do ground. He did clouds, stars, archetypes. You see, he had created a language that couldn't be challenged. Because it wasn't personal. It was symbolic. You'd ask why he didn't show up for you, and he'd reply, "I'm battling my animus." You'd say you felt abandoned, and he'd say, "This is the necessary dissolution of the ego." And it all sounded so true, but none of it was real. Real, after all, is not always poetic. Sometimes it's clumsy, Sometimes it's ordinary. Sometimes it's just picking up the phone. He didn't want real. He wanted resonance, a hit of emotional intensity, followed by silence. Connection as catharsis, not continuity. And here's the tragedy. You were willing to carry the myth. You were willing to hurt for it, because it had given you something. Language for your own depth, meaning for your ache. But you didn't notice what it had taken. It had taken your ability to ask for more. It had taken your trust in your own needs. Jung warned us that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But sometimes, the more terrifying thing is asking another to accept you. Not the wounded mystic version, not the sacred archetype, but the mundane, scared, imperfect, needy you. You couldn't ask him for that, because you knew the answer. He didn't want all of you. He wanted the version that made him feel profound. He wanted the woman who cried in metaphors, who ached in verses. And when you began to speak plainly, "When will I see you? Why didn't you answer? Are you still in this with me?" He called it regression, ego clinging, an old story. But you were never clinging. You were reaching for a hand that was never going to stay. And somewhere inside, you knew. You started to feel embarrassed by your desire. You started to apologize for your humanness. You started to shrink your voice, afraid you'd sound too low vibration. And that is the final echo of this quiet betrayal. You learned to doubt your own reality. You stopped trusting your hurt. You questioned whether you were too much, too sensitive, not evolved enough. But that was never the truth. The truth is this. He used your depth to feel whole. He used your need to feel needed. He used your pain to write poetry in which he was always the savior. And when he had wrung every sacred insight from the sponge of your soul, he left. Or maybe worse, he stayed just enough to keep you hoping. That's what makes this kind of harm so invisible. It doesn't come with violence. It comes with reverence. And yet, the wound is no less real. Maybe he did see you. Maybe he even loved you, in the only way he knew how. But love without responsibility is not love. It is longing masquerading as connection. It is shadow dancing with shadow. Silence. A single breath. And now you are left not just with pain, but with awakening. Because the end of this story is not about him. It's about you, and what you will do now with the mirror he left behind. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung once said, is to become who you truly are. But what he never said, at least not out loud, is that sometimes you only find that self in the ashes of someone else's myth. And so here you are, not broken but altered, not abandoned but released. Though not in the way that feels clean or holy. You are left with fragments, memories that don't add up, words that echo without closure, touch that lingers even when the body is gone. You are still trying to answer a question that was never yours to carry. Was I ever real to him? That question is a ghost. And here is where the real work begins. Not the intoxicating soulmate kind of work, but the dry, sober labor of self-reclamation. The quiet revolution of saying, I existed. I mattered, even if he didn't know how to stay. You see, he never had to lie to you. He only had to speak to the part of you that was still waiting to be chosen. And it's not your fault you responded. Because when someone speaks to your longing with poetry, it feels like love. When someone gives your pain meaning, it feels like healing. And when someone walks into your life with language you've never heard but have always known, it feels like home. But the soul does not live on metaphor. It lives on presence. And presence was the one thing he couldn't give. This is the final paradox. He awakened you, not because he saw you, but because you saw yourself through him. And for the first time, you couldn't look away. He carried the archetype of the magician, the one who opens doors but never walks through them, the one who turns pain into parable, love into longing, presence into performance. The magician is seductive because he promises transformation, but what he rarely tells you is that you are the experiment. That's what this was, not love. Alchemy. You were the prima materia, chaos made precious. He stirred you. He watched you shimmer, and then he left before the gold could cool. But here's the deeper truth, one that burns and heals in equal measure. He didn't take you. He revealed you. He brought you to a cliff's edge, and while he stepped back, You jumped, not to fall but to fly, because what he awakened was not a need for him, but a need for your own wholeness. You began to ask harder questions. You began to notice your patterns, the way you collapse into those who see your depth but not your dignity, the way you confuse recognition with reliability, the way you make space for others' shadows, hoping they'll love you in return. This is individuation. This is the fire Jung spoke of, not the kind that comforts, but the kind that burns away illusion. And yes, it's lonely, because real awakening always is. You begin to grieve, not just the person, but the version of you who believed love would look like salvation. You begin to forgive the self who waited by the phone, the self who studied his texts like sacred scripture, the self who stayed soft when she wanted to scream. You begin to mourn the story, the beautiful, impossible, almost true story. And then you begin to write a new one. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, Jung wrote, to avoid facing their own soul. But you aren't avoiding anymore. You are walking directly into that soul space, into the parts of you that waited for someone else to notice. And you are noticing them yourself. You become your own witness, your own analyst, your own lover. You stop translating your needs into cosmic riddles. You stop apologizing for your humanity. You stop shrinking your longing to fit into his silence. You understand now. It was never your job to be understood by him. It was your calling to understand yourself. And yes, there is still love, even now, even after all of it, because he did open something sacred in you. That can't be erased. And you don't need it to be. You don't need to hate him to heal. You don't need to reframe him as a narcissist, a predator, a villain. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who are also the most wounded. Not because they intend harm, but because they don't know they're still bleeding. And you were the one who stood close enough to catch the blood. That doesn't make him evil, it makes him unfinished. And it makes you free. So what now? Now you become the thing you were always searching for. Now, you hold your own darkness without needing someone else to name it. Now, you walk with that ache inside you, not as a wound, but as a doorway. And when someone new comes along, and they will, you'll ask different questions. You won't ask, do they see my soul? You'll ask, do they stay when it gets messy? Do they show up when I speak plainly? Do they know how to hold, not just interpret? You'll want less fire and more earth, less resonance, more reliability, less mythology, more Monday morning. And when someone says, you are magic, you'll smile, but you'll also say, yes, and I also need you to text me back, because that's the balance. That's the art, to be deep and grounded, to be mystical and mundane, to be sacred and human. He did not stay, but he did leave you something. The beginning of a journey, not to him, not to another, but to the part of you that no longer needs to be used to feel valuable. This is your individuation, not a straight line, but a spiral, not a rescue, but a return. If this spoke to something in you, if it named a truth you've been carrying alone, then you already know this space is for you. Here we don't do quick fixes. We explore the quiet corners of the soul. Subscribe if you're ready for more than answers. If you're ready for questions that change you. Because the real journey doesn't start when someone else sees you. It starts when you do.